Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and to share the stage with some excellent speakers today. I'm Jason Halford. I'm from the north of England, so I have to remember not to speak fast and not to speak in an accent for you. And if I do start doing either of those things, wave your arms frantically, because even though the spotlights are glaring in my eyes, I can still just about make out some of you there. Now, as Draw mentioned, I'm President-elect of the European Association for the Study of Obesity, and that's our logo. And Draw and Luca head our Obesity Management Task Force. We have... Oh, hello. That was a quick talk. Brilliant. It's the accent, that was the warning. And it's lovely to work with organisations such as this one today to bring on these training events. We run lots of training events such as Train the Trainers, and we have an obesity management comms network. So go and talk to Luca and Draw at the end of this session if you're interested in either of them. And of course, we'd love to welcome you to our Congress in Glasgow in April of this year, because of course it'll be really warm in Glasgow in April. Right. I am a psychologist, so I'm not going to talk about physiology. I certainly have no real knowledge of surgery, although we have done a little bit of work in bariatric surgery looking at alcohol misuse. And Paul, my colleague, may say a little bit more about surgery and pharmacotherapy. But I'm going to open the behavioural session. Here are my conflicts of interest. None are particularly relevant to the talk today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about appetite expression in obesity and the issues around appetite, both through weight loss but also through weight maintenance, because weight maintenance is active weight management. For somebody who's lost 30 kilograms 2 years ago, I can tell you that from personal experience. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about appetite? Well, hunger, we understand what hunger is. We experience hunger. It's the drive to consume. It elicits and sustains a behavioural response, i.e. eating, to a biological need. It has physiological determinants, insulin levels, ghrelin levels, but also situational. It's also very cue-driven through your daily routine. Wanting is a different component of appetite. Wanting is specific to certain food items, okay? You want this. So hunger is general, wanting is a very specific thing. It's manifest explicitly, you feel cravings for that particular thing, but also implicitly, you will orientate to that food in the environment. Liking, well, to want something, you have to like it first. I'm going to move this a little out of the way because it's putting me off a bit and I can't see my slides. So you need to like something to want something, but all of these three things, liking, wanting, and hunger, drive food intake. But there are processes, of course, which limit food intake. There are within meal processes, such as satiation, processes physiological, psychological, sensory, during a meal, which brings a meal to an end, and also post-meal satiety, that continued suppression of appetite after intake. And I'll come back to these terms through the talk. But we need to think about how these relate to patient experience. And what patients are doing is they're engaging in inhibitory control, trying to exert control over their own energy intake. Well, we have these processes associated with satiety, hunger, satiation, and satiety, and we have these reward-driven processes associated with liking and wanting. And those processes interact, and they also feed up to inhibitory control. So it is intuitive that if you're feeling less hungry and you're feeling more satiated, inhibitory control is easier. But it's also intuitive that if you're more responsive to food cues and you're experiencing more craving, inhibitory control is more difficult because it's taking up more of your executive function, your cognitive reserves to resist consumption. Why is appetite important? Well, appetite is interface between all of the biological mechanisms that you've been talking about and that environment. So appetite is the expression, it leads to eating behavior, and depending on how much and what you've consumed, it affects energy intake. That is done within an environment, but has biological impact, and it is the biological impact which is important. Now, when people ask me as a psychologist what phenomena are associated with obesity and adiposity, there's two ways that I kind of think, or I break it down. On the first side, on the left-hand side here, we have that hunger satiety sort of perspective. On that right-hand side, which has become increasingly more important in psychological research around obesity, we have that reward and inhibitory control side. So just turning to the left-hand side of this slide at the moment, what we see in individuals with obesity, particularly as BMI levels get high and also as levels of eating psychopathology such as binge eating get higher, is we see increased eating rate during a meal. And what's interesting about that increased eating rate is obviously they're eating more rapidly, but they're also not decelerating as you naturally would during a meal. So it suggests normal mechanisms of within meal satiation are not operating adequately, if at all. And after consumption, there is a weaker post-meal satiety response. Hunger rebounds quickly. And that speaks to real physiological weaknesses, and I'll show you a slide about that later. But also, when you talk to individuals with obesity, they will talk about their experience and they will talk about food controlling them, not them being in control of the food. And that's a really important concept. They do demonstrate heightened responsiveness for food cues. And in obesity, that's difficult to interpret because they could be orientating to the food because they want the food. They could also be orientating the food because if they're in active weight management, that food is a threat signal. So either way, they're orientating to the food. Heightened hedonic responses to palatable food, and experiences of uncontrolled hunger and greater disinhibition of eating behavior. And this is why patients will talk about addiction. They will talk about their relationship with food in terms of addiction. Now, we can argue about addiction and how we use that concept in obesity, but for patients, this concept has real meaning. Just take you back to what I said about within meal satiation. And this is from a drug study. It's actually the control group. We were testing sibutramine in patients with obesity, actually at the dose prescribed. It's one of the few studies which did that, which is published. And this is with John Wilding, who many of you in this field will be very familiar with. Now, these are individual patients, and this is their eating rate. So we've got the time in minutes, and we've got grams up the side of the graph. And what is interesting is patients are eating up to nearly well, not quite, yeah, some of them are eating over 1 kilogram of pasta. This is an energy-dense pasta meal, and they're just consuming and consuming it. And you can see very few are showing that natural slowdown in their eating rate. Some are actually accelerating during the meal. So, from the control data, we can see that these individuals, and they're clinically obese, have issues around within meal satiation. Interestingly, when we added sibutramine, actually we started restoring, in some of those individuals, more regular decelerating curves. This speaks to post-meal satiety, and many people in this room will know Rachel Batterham's work in this early study on PYY. And this is endogenous PYY levels. And what I think is interesting, and I'm not a physiologist by any means, but if we look at the pre-meal levels of endogenous PYY in the individuals with obesity, it is lower. So they've got lower basal levels of a hormone associated with satiety. So they're going to be more hungry. You put them, like the lean individuals, you allow them ad libitum buffet lunch and look at the PYY response. It is half that of the individuals who are normal weight. So they're getting less PYY from that PYY response from that buffet meal. What's interesting in that study is they actually ate more than the lean individuals. So they've got eat more, but they've got less response. So it's kind of understandable that they're going to go back and eat because they're not getting that physiological signal. So that physiological signal is not working optimally. Now I'm going to move to the reward side of things and talk about food cue reactivity, which is that automatic response I mentioned before, and I'm also going to talk about cravings, and cravings is the feelings. That's why I've divided the two. So one's the underpinning response and one's the subjective experience. Okay. So we know individuals with obesity are more reactive to food cues. Their attention is more easily grabbed and it's more easily held by those cues. And that could be because of their orientating to the food because of their wanting it, but also it could be because they're in active weight management and they're trying to resist it. But when hungry, these effects become more potent and attention-grabbing. They could become more attention-grabbing to all of us. And this effect is more pronounced in individuals who are overweight or obese. Now, high BMI correlates with severity of cravings during dieting. So it seems cravings seem to be more pronounced in people who are overweight and obese while under active weight management. And we see subject cravings in overweight individuals associated with food cue responsiveness. That should happen because of the two components of the reward mechanisms I've talked about. And we see increased BMI associated with more frequent craving. That in itself is not an issue, but craving for specific foods is associated with increased intake of them. So it has consequences. Craving has consequences in terms of individuals' behaviour. I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of the food environment. And here I'm going to turn to a completely different area of our work, which is on the effects of advertising on children's food intake. Okay. And we've been working in this area for about 15 years. We got into it completely by accident because I wanted to look at food cues and obesity. And we knew when we took adults into the laboratory that as soon as we took adults with obesity into the laboratory, they didn't eat anything. And I chose food adverts because food adverts were a good food cue. So we decided to do it in children, we decided to do it in schools, and we used adverts. And we expected the overweight and children, the children with obesity, to remember more food adverts and eat more after food adverts. And we thought the lean children, the normal weight children, would do neither. And as we predicted, the children with obesity or the children who were overweight remembered more adverts if we showed them food adverts than if we did show them toy adverts. The normal weight children remembered the same number of adverts, but the children who were overweight or the children who had obesity remembered more food adverts. So hypothesis proved. But if you look at the left-hand side, all children exposed to food adverts, whether irrespective of their weight status, increase their food intake. So food adverts are a potent stimulator of, certainly within the immediate period after showing the food adverts in a cartoon, food intake. One of the problems with this is we did a cognitive test. We worried our cognitive test had biased the results. So we repeated the study and took the cognitive test out. And here you can see the effects on children are more pronounced, but you can see the weight status effects, or the difference in weight status effects, are more pronounced as well. Now, there is a vast literature here, and I could talk about this subject for hours. But what we know from the neuroimaging literature is, first of all, irrespective of weight status, if you show children food adverts, then their response to food tends to be more driven by reward. So reward systems are driven. And that's what advertising is to do. Advertising is there to get you to like. So it's not surprising that people's liking systems respond when exposure to marketing. But there's an interesting difference between children with obesity and normal weight children, is that when you show food logos, normal weight children, their inhibitory control system also lights up. Okay. Remember, it's the interplay between reward and inhibitory control which is important here. Whereas children with obesity, that inhibitory control system is not lighting up, so they're responding to logos like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, so on and so forth. This is just to show that it's a robust effect. This is a meta-analysis done by Emma Boyland with the help of other people in this room. Not particularly much help from me because I'm not very good with numbers, which is why Paul does a lot of work with me. But it just shows the robustness of the effects in children. And it also shows, actually at the top, that you don't really see that effect in adults. But that's not surprising because this is not a paradigm which we'd expect to work in adults because they kind of guess what the study was about. So we have this model now where appetite and eating behaviour are influenced by the environment, cultural and societal pressures, snacking, eating out, eating alone, the food environment, which is cheap, readily prepared and easily available, and branding and promotion, that active promotion of energy-dense food. That affects eating behaviour, and what is in your immediate environment when you express that eating behaviour, the food formulation, where foods high in fat, salt and sugar, portion size we've talked about as well, and nutritional knowledge. That's ability to judge what you're eating and to understand the nutritional knowledge. That determines what you actually consume. And those processes can lead to passive overconsumption because you might not be aware of the energy density of your food and how many calories are going in, but active overconsumption, the active seeking and overconsumption of those foods. Those both feed back. We know those both feed back in terms of episodic systems. We talked about the satiety hormones and their effectiveness in terms of signaling satiety, but we also know that actually as individuals gain weight, they become leptin insensitive as well. So these feedback systems are eventually become ineffective. Now, if you've got ineffective feedback into homeostatic regulatory systems, and they're meant to be in balance with reward systems, what happens is reward systems dominate. And if reward systems are dominated, you end up with hedonically driven hunger, and you have to, or you need to try and exert far more inhibitory control to resist that. So that's kind of the model that we're operating on. I'm going to say a little bit about dieting and energy restriction. And dieting and energy restriction is an important component of weight maintenance, not just of weight loss, as I've said previously. Now, I'm surprised nobody's shown this slide, so I'm quite happy that nobody's shown this slide. And this just is a range of studies which have produced weight loss. So these are different studies which produce weight loss, and we can see the weight loss from baseline. Now, let's add in the weight maintenance, and we can see that most of those individuals in those studies, have regained most of the weight they lost. This is from 2007. It would be interesting to redo this, I think, and actually go through some more recent studies. And obviously, you've seen data pertaining to differing treatment approaches. When I think of dieting, and I have had some experience in the past of the eating disorders literature, what we know is dieting produces psychological deprivation, as well as the physiological consequences of energy deficit that have been talked about already. And what we know from the dieting literature, irrespective of weight status, is it causes obsessions with food, increased responsiveness to food cues, cravings, loss of concentration, and dysphoric mood. And obviously, none of these things are helpful. We also know that energy restriction and weight loss reduce satiety hormones. We've seen a slide on that already, but I'll talk to that. When I think of the dieting literature, I often go back to the Minnesota self-starvation study, and many of you will be familiar with this. And this is when conscientious objectors in the Second World War volunteered to take part in a study run by the US government to understand what a large European populations starved after the Second World War would behave like. And these individuals were put on restricted diets, similar in terms of the restriction to low-calorie or very low-calorie diets we use today. And unsurprisingly, they became increasingly preoccupied with food. They had relentless thoughts about eating and inhibited concentration on usual daily activities, and serious difficulties in adhering to the diet when they were put in situations where there was lots of food. And that will be familiar to many of you who have conversations with patients. What was also interesting about this study is they followed those patients a long time afterwards, and many of them had issues with food that remained after they regained their weight. They never had issues before they'd entered the study. Now, Draw has already shown you this slide, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But what this slide shows, obviously, individuals come into the laboratory and they're hungry. They have breakfast and their hunger and desire to eat dips. And then slowly, the post-meal satiety wears off and they become more hungry and they desire to eat. So that homeostatic, but also that reward-driven component of appetite flux across the day in response to the meal. We can see after weight reduction, so 10 weeks, we can see, obviously you still got the same profile. Your breakfast still reduces hunger. Your breakfast still reduces desire to eat. But we can see the levels across the day, the profile has shifted upwards. And after a year, well, they've not regained all their weight in that year, so they're not weight stable yet. But we can still see during this post-intervention maintenance phase that levels of hunger and desire to eat are higher. And the biological mechanisms may underpin this. We can talk about leptin, ghrelin, and GLP-1, and that's already been covered in other talks. It's the increase in appetite and the increase in preference for energy-dense foods, high in fat and high in sugar, which is what is important here, okay, because the hormones are affecting how people are interfacing with their food environment. I'm going to say a little bit about food cue reactivity and craving in dieters. So food cue responsiveness, hunger predicts EEG response and heightens perception to food cues. If you're hungry, you orientate. But low food cue reactivity predicts more successful weight loss in dieters. So low food cue activity is interesting. That could be an important predictor of outcome, and if you could train it, that might be useful as well. Dietists experience stronger cravings that are harder to resist, and typically these are for the energy-dense foods that are being restricted. And trait, not state, cravings determine success or unsuccess or lack of success in diet as well. So therefore, food cue responsiveness and cravings act as a barrier to weight loss success, irrespective of weight status, but they may also, through a variety of therapeutic approaches, it could be behavioural, it could be pharmacological, and no doubt surgery has an effect on these processes as well, have an effect in terms of aiding long-term outcome. Now, I'm not going to talk about this model too much because I'm running out of time, but this is a model in a paper from 2017 by Carl Roberts in our lab showing how dieting increases hunger and food responsiveness, undermining inhibitory control, which affects cognitive functions. It also has a negative effect on mood, which reduces self-regulation and reinforces food-related coping strategies, and negative mood reduces inhibitory control and other executive functions. So I'd direct you to the paper there. I'm going to talk a little bit in the time that I've got left about the broader psychology of obesity, and we've already talked about stress and coping and life events, and I think this is very important because, again, we talk about all these concepts around appetite and control and hunger. It's things like depression, stress, coping and maladaptive coping is what patients will be talking about. Now, we know there is a reciprocal bidirectional link between depression and obesity, such that if you have obesity at baseline, you're more likely to become depressed over time, and conversely, if you have depression, you're more likely to become obese as well. So that reciprocal relationship. And this is some really interesting data which has come out from a colleague in my lab, and this is the Millennium cohort in the UK. And the interesting thing about cohorts is very rarely do they have decent psychological variables in them. So when people say, well, what predicts stuff? We go, or tell me, well, not much psychology predicts things. I'm going, well, there's very few studies which include a full range of psychological tools. And this just shows that BMI and internalization, which is a measure of depression or an indication of depression in children, increase over time from age 3 to 5 to 7. So they're increasing both at the same time. And there's a fairly weak relationship between the two. But at age 7, BMI starts predicting internalization, and internalization starts predicting BMI. So these things become, in this cross-lag model, quite important. And what's interesting is when we take factors out such as socioeconomic status, which is a very important, Paul will come to that in terms of the relationship between obesity and depression. When we take that out, we see that depression at age 7 predicts BMI at age 11, and BMI at age 11 predicts depression at age 14. So there's there is a reciprocal loop here. And if anybody tells you that they're interested in treating child mental health, tell them about obesity, because obesity is important. It is a child mental health issue. We know, and we talked a lot about the role of personal circumstances in weight gain. And we know current events, traumatic life events such as breakups, widowhood, and things like that are important. We saw the maps, the individual maps that Robert showed, and we know that past trauma, abuse, and things like that do play a role. And if you have a group of female patients with a female therapist, it is surprising how quickly this topic of abuse comes up in that therapeutic situation. But when I think about these things, I think about coping strategies and I think about stress, and I think these are very important. The effects of stress on mood and dietary restraints in weight management success are widely acknowledged. And one thing I always find quite interesting is identical twins discordant for body weight. The difference between visceral fat accumulation between siblings is associated with psychosocial stress. Now, many of you will know about cortisol and things like that, and I'm not going to talk to a room of qualified endocrinologists about hormones. That would be career suicide. But I think it's important to acknowledge the importance of the nature of the stress as well as the physiological underpinnings. We know repeated exposure to stressful life situations are associated with a greater preference for energy-dense foods and nutrient-dense foods rich in fat and sugar. And when you think about stress and mood and their impact on dietary restraint, as I say, we have to think about coping strategies. And coping strategies relate to temptations, and they also relate to lapses. And temptations and lapses is a very interesting way of looking at this, because it speaks about individual events. Okay. And now we have things like momentary time sampling and ecological momentary assessment. We can actually measure these things in real time using apps on people's phones. It's been tremendous because we've had to rely on retrospective questionnaires or trying to simulate these things in the lab, and they're not ideal methodological approaches. Temptations, well, temptation is a sudden urge to break a diet which you are close to the brink, and there's lots of things which lead to temptation. Obviously, appetite, hunger, feeling less full. Temptations can happen anywhere, and they're related to mood, sadness, deprivation, stress, boredom, and also being less relaxed. Lapses is an incident where you actually broke your diet. It's when a temptation actually led to a lapse, again associated with hunger, less satisfied. Interestingly, lapses tend to be more situational, at home, at evening, at the weekends, and those who work with patients will recognize these things. They're also associated with abstinence violation as well. Worry, less prepared to resist, less confidence. So lapses associated with abstinence violation, they are an abstinence violation, but then they lead on to further lapses. Now, 2 studies were done in this area. One which looked at individuals trying to manage their own weight, and in that study, temptations led to lapses. The other, second study, were where individuals were on a structured behavioural program, and in that study, the lapses did not lead temptations did not lead to lapses. And that's because in that behavioural intervention, those individuals had adopted coping strategies. And those coping strategies were, first of all, to reduce their exposure to temptations, but then find ways of preventing them triggering lapse. Another important way another important approach is to look at managing the consequences of lapsing as well, to deal with these abstinent violations. I'm going to introduce the concept of inhibitory control. Paul's going to talk a little bit about this more in the context of pharmacotherapy and bariatric surgery. Inhibitory control is the ability or inability to stop, change, or delay an inappropriate response to the food environment. And we know that exposure to high caloric foods reduces the ability of individuals to exert inhibitory control. And that happens whether you're healthy or overweight or you have obesity. And we know there is an association between impairments for craving for food, impairments in inhibitory control and craving for food and BMI. So the two together pose a risk factor for obesity. So an impaired inhibitory control, along with persistent cravings, are associated with increased BMI. But can we do anything about inhibitory control? Well, there's lots of work in the alcohol and other addiction use using inhibitory control training methods. Now, for alcohol and drugs, it's easy because usually they're 1 or 2 specific things. Now, for food, there's lots of different things. But actually, what inhibitory control training can potentially do is allow you to tailor your intervention to the foods and the food situations that individuals have issues with. Now, the problem here is we're lacking a lot of data, and most of the data relies on self-report measures of weight, and there needs to be replication. But we do have the potential for therapeutic intervention by which we can strengthen inhibitory control, and interestingly, strengthening inhibitory control reduces cravings, so it works back down the system. So I'll finish there because Paul has quite a bit to say, and just say appetite consists of an interactive processes of hunger, wanting, liking, satiation and satiety, which all help or undermine the individual's ability to resist. Weaker regulatory control, along with elevated food cue activity, are associated with higher BMI and cravings, and also that dieting and energy restriction also has an impact. So we're asking people to diet who have obesity, who already have impaired appetite, to engage in something which impairs their appetite further. So you can kind of see the kind of paradox in that. Obesity, the psychology of obesity, stress and coping probably mediate the link between depression and obesity, and Paul's talked to that through temptations and lapses. However, interventions targeting reward and satiety and inhibitory control, when personalised, could provide therapeutic opportunities both to allow the patients in terms of weight loss, but also manage weight maintenance more effectively. And I'll stop there now. Thank you.